What's the scariest gut feeling you had that came true? Story 1. I worked at a hospital, PRN, and frequently picked up extra shifts. I worked overnight and had asked the supervisor to go ahead and put me down to work the next night. Well, as the night went on, I just felt awful, like completely doomed. I'd never wanted so badly to be home. I lived an hour away from my job. So by the morning, I called the supervisor and asked her to remove me from the schedule. So I went home feeling unexplainably scared. By the time I woke up, I was getting calls that an EF5 tornado had hit the town I worked in and the hospital I worked at. Story 2, I used to work as a nurse in an old people's home. I had great contact with one of the little old ladies there. One night, after having helped her get to bed, I said, "Good night, see you tomorrow," knowing I was coming in the next morning. "Oh no," she said merrily. "I don't think we'll see each other tomorrow." It felt kind of off, and I went home feeling strange about it. When I came into work the next morning, she had died peacefully in her sleep, no more than a few hours after I'd left her. Story 3. By the time I was 13, my mom had been battling cancer for a year and a half. It was a few days after my birthday, and she was due for an IV port surgery the following morning. Just a simple day surgery, right? She came to my room to say goodnight, and I freaked out. For some reason, I knew this surgery would not go well. This is after she had lung surgery and multiple bouts of chemo and radiation on her chest and brain. She reassured me that it was fine and that we would go bowling a few days later. She never returned home. During the surgery, her remaining full lung collapsed, and it went entirely downhill from there. Just over a month later, she passed away. I have no idea what caused my fear of that being the end, but unfortunately, I was right. Story 4. When I was in my late teens, I was hanging out with a friend in my room. Suddenly, I started feeling panicky with something telling me to leave the house. I decided to listen to my gut and told my friend we had to go to the store right now. Went outside to find my dad passed out in his truck looking really sick and pale. Me and my friend pulled him out of the truck and he called 911 while I performed CPR on my dad and saved his life. Later found out he had overdosed and choked on his own vomit. Who knows what would have happened if I didn't have the overwhelming urge to walk to the store for no reason. Story 5 was doing overnight security at an old hotel turned dormitory that rented out rooms to the public as well. Just a cluster truck of a place with many seedy individuals living there. Always prided myself on going down every dark hallway, leaving no stone unturned, etc. This one night, though, I got to the double doors that went to a particularly dark hallway leading to the back entrance to the kitchen and froze. "No," I said to myself, "I'm not going down there tonight." This was extremely out of character for me, and I had no idea what would cause me to all of a sudden have so strong an urge to stay out of there. But it was like really strong, so I went with my gut. I was kind of embarrassed about it and didn't tell anyone. That night, at that exact time, there was a strung out addict robbing the kitchen, and there were really sharp, gigantic cheese knives hanging all over the place, just in case he didn't have his own weapon. I'm pretty sure he would have attacked me as the only witness had I gone down there that night. Who knows who would have come out on top, but I like to think something saved me that night. But if it was my subconscious, how did it assess that there was someone down there before I even opened the doors? Story 6. Not really mine, but I think it counts. My mom was going to the dentist a few years ago, and she decided that she wanted to bring my brothers and I, but at the last second, she said that we should stay home because she felt something was wrong. Later that day, I got a phone call from her, and her voice was very weak, saying how I should not worry and that she would be fine. She was in a car accident, and the passenger side, where I always sit, caved in at least 3 feet. And if I was sitting there, I would have been toast. I love you, Mom. Story 7. My mom is a nurse who works the night shift. As a child, I was a worrier, always worried. In my head, I always feared that Mom would get into a wreck on her way home from work. Fast forward to 2006, and I've just walked into one of my classes, and my teacher calls roll. He gets to me and says, "Vaughn, you're on the absentee. Says you're supposed to be with your aunt." My aunt taught bio at my high school. I thought that was odd. As far as I knew, I didn't know of any reason I'd be excused from class that day. I walked to my aunt's class, and her student teacher told me she had an important call. She's in the office. I knew almost immediately that it was my mom. I knew she had wrecked. At the same time I had that thought, my and my brother's name came over the PA system to report to the office. I started bawling in the doorway, and the student teacher probably thought I was crazy. Got to the office and found out I was correct. My mom was cut off by a reckless driver on her way home at around 7 a.m. She spun off the road and into the forest and went down an embankment. She broke or crushed everything on her left side, and the woman who ran her off the road kept driving. My mom had been passed out in her car for about 3 hours before a passing motorist saw a headlight reflect in his rearview window. He checked his mirrors, but didn't see any other car in the road behind him. So he went to investigate and found my mom about 75 yards into the woods. She was in a dense cover, and her car was black. You couldn't see anything from the road at all, and the only reason she was found was because her busted headlight flickered. and the man driving by just happened to see it. She ended up making a full recovery. Story 8. The night before my brother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, this was only 2 weeks back. I was over at my uncle's. During the night, I had this feeling of dread. I wanted to be with my father and mother. Brother lives away from us. In the night, I had a horrible dream. An indistinguishable figure was lying on a bed dying. I am woken up by my aunt who informs me my brother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I don't know what warranted that dream and feeling, but it was definitely something horrible. Story 9. I think a gut feeling led to me not being kidnapped. I was maybe 9 at the time. I was in a department store, wandering on my own, when all of a sudden the most terrible gut-wrenching feeling came over me. I don't know how, but I knew I had to get back to my mom. I ran to the aisle she was in. A man hurriedly followed me into the aisle. When he saw I was with my mother, he stood there for a few seconds and stared at me before walking away. I will never forget that feeling, or his terrifying face. Story 10. I was in my early 20s, alone, driving on a major highway. In the lane to my left was a semi. Right behind my right ear, I heard a frantic, "Get away from the truck!" It wasn't super loud, but it was authoritative. So not even questioning my sanity, I put on my brakes and let the truck get several car lengths ahead. Within 7 seconds probably, one of the truck's tires blew out and the truck swerved hard into the lane that I was in. Had I still been next to the truck, I would have been pushed down an embankment, doing 65. I wouldn't call it a gut feeling, because I swear on everything that I am, I heard that voice in my ear. Zero explanation, but I'm okay with that because somehow I avoided a major accident that could have been devastating. Story 11. I've lived in South Louisiana my entire life, about an hour south of New Orleans. In July 2005, I was only 11 years old. I kept having this recurring nightmare of me lying in my backyard, staring at the sky, and suddenly a large brown wave of water, probably 30 feet high, came up and washed my entire neighborhood away. It would always end right after the wave crashed and I would wake up. Then, Hurricane Katrina hit a month later. My hometown was out of power for 2 weeks, but thankfully there was no flooding. But then I had the same dream after Katrina hit, except I saw the aftermath. I kept seeing dead animals floating past me as I tried to swim to my house. When I woke up, I had this horrible feeling that something horrible was going to happen to us. Hurricane Rita was making landfall, and we were waiting it out at my house. I kept telling my mom that I wanted to go to my aunt's house, which was in the parish north of. She said no and told me to go back to sleep. About an hour later, the levees in my town broke, and our entire town had an hour to evacuate. Most of our parish was under 6 feet of water. I lost 2 classmates and 6 family members. When we came back about a week later, everything was coated in mud. There were dozens of dead animals all over the road. Most of us were homeless for years after, but at least we're alive. So now, when I tell my mom something, she listens. Story 12. My friend and I went to the midnight premiere of The Dark Knight Rises. I don't live near Aurora, but the whole night during the movie, I didn't feel safe, and I really wanted to leave because multiple people were dressed in costumes, and I went over ways to escape the theater if anything happened. I went home later that night and heard what happened. Holy crap, this hits close to home. Me and my friend were actually planning to go to the midnight premiere at that very theater since it was the one we lived closest to. But that night after work, I had a strange feeling and just wanted to go to sleep. So when he called, I said we could just see it the next morning. Woke up to 20 missed calls from my family, all asking if I was okay. Because the last they had heard from me, I told them I was seeing it. My gut feelings don't come often, but when they do, man, are they right? Story 13. I never liked my father. I always said I would never treat my kids like he treated me. I always said, I will never be like my father. I often expressed that it was my greatest fear in life to end up like him. I also said similar things about my stepfather. That guy simply hated me. I was so different from the rest of the family. There was a phrase I would use when things got crazy. What am I? The milkman's son? I said it jokingly, but I said it thousands of times over the years. Well, it turns out that I am not the milkman's son. I am the son of a corporate lawyer in NYC. My mother, stepfather, and that butthead who pretended to be my father all knew who my father was, and they kept both me and my biological father in the dark for decades. I have only known the truth for a few years, still trying to adjust. But in my gut, I knew something was off all those years. I knew I did not belong. I just did not fit in. I do not talk with my so-called family anymore. However, my father and I have bonded greatly, and we are trying to make up for the decades we never shared. Story 14. True story, I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 happened and was kind of a worrywart. I'd always watched the news/read newspapers and had a solid understanding of who bin Laden was and what his goal was. I remember on 9/10 and around 11 a.m., I got a really bad feeling in my mind and went to the nurse's office. I called my mom and told her I wasn't feeling well, and needed to get sent home from school. She was busy working and couldn't come get me, but said she would ask my grandfather if he could. He agreed and showed up within about 30 minutes. When I got into his car, he looked at me and said, "You look fine." We talked for a good portion of the ride home, and at some point I remember saying to him, "I thought tomorrow was going to be the day the world ended." I believed wholeheartedly we were going to be attacked on a massive scale. I'm talking nukes and all that. Obviously, it wasn't that drastic, but still, that next day was 9/11. And I'll never forget the feeling in my stomach during third period when my principal pulled my teacher from the classroom and she came back in and turned the TV on to see the first tower smoking, haunting. Story 15. Not me, but my dad. My family and some of my parents' friends were supposed to go abroad to take part in a wedding. The day before we were supposed to go, my dad woke up after a nightmare, in full panic. I remember thinking it was scary to see a grown up being so afraid of a nightmare. But it resulted in us not going, and I was so mad because I had been looking forward to it for ages and told all my friends at school about it. But Dad refused to go. It was the 28th of September, 1994. The country we were supposed to visit was Estonia, and the ferry we were supposed to be on sank that night. 852 people died. My dad later described the feeling as an alarm inside my body, shouting at me that this is wrong, it will not end well, don't do it. The alarm was so strong it could not be ignored. It's not like a normal worry before you make a long trip, not at all. The normal worry is like a car alarm going off on your street. You notice it, but pay no attention to it, and so it goes away. This was a more like an explosion. Story 16. I was at a pet store with my kids getting some fish. I noticed this guy walking around the store, but not really focusing on one thing. He looked at the fish, the cat food, and dog toys. Most people don't go to a pet store to browse, but he was. He made eye contact with me every so often, so I noticed him. The look was very intense. I paid for our fish and noticed he was in line with a few people behind us, but didn't have anything in his hands. I walked back into the store and pretended that I forgot to check the price of something. The guy got out of line and started walking around the store again. I told the kids whoever got into the car fastest would get a prize. I needed them to hurry without scaring them. We booked it to the car, and I locked the doors even before they had their seatbelts on. I turned around just as the dude was banging on my window, and I drove off. Story 17. For myself, it's the scariest, because it's the scariest one to come true so far. For years, before I even had a driver's license, I would see the right front of my car hit someone, and she or he would roll up the hood and hit the windshield. Just fragments of that. The sight of a face, the flash of a hand, the feeling in my chest of screaming. When it came true, the person is okay. The biggest shock was how accurate the visual image turned out to be for such a vague situation. I could not have predicted the date, time, what car I was driving, who was with me, how bad it would be seen. Oh, nothing. It was pure circumstance that the person wasn't killed. Luck. But that feeling was worse for the fact that I've seen many of those fragments or felt the sensation for lots of good stuff and quite a bit worse since I was young. Some have come true, and some don't really have the opportunity anymore. So I guess I had just decided it was an OCD is bad thought. I kind of shock babbled to my mom. I saw this already, and it turns out it runs more strongly in my family than I realized. Anecdotally, my grandmother would write things down with a date and seal them in an envelope, and there were some still left when she passed. The good ones I can see doing that for, but the rest, I don't know. Potential inevitability is intense. Story 18. I was playing a prank on some friends, and I was hiding in a locker, ready to jump out at them. They weren't coming, and I felt a bit off, so I stayed in the locker. Footsteps went past me, and I felt scared, so I hunched smaller into the locker. There was screaming from down the hall, and the announcement for lockdown came over the PA for Mr. Glendine. It's the name of a street behind our school, and code for lockdown, not a real teacher, to report to C362, the room just down the hallway, from the locker I was hiding in. Apparently, the story was that a girl was living in Australia with her mother, who is Australian, and they both have citizenship. And her Malaysian father had come to take her to Malaysia, even though they had a restraining order. Story 19. When I was in grade 12, I never really texted. I had a BlackBerry, enough said, and always kept my phone on silent, and usually in my purse. One night I was sitting downstairs, and I got this urge to put my ringer on. I went to put it on and realized I had a text from my friend that was sent around 5 minutes before. It said, "Ash, would you care if I died?" I answered right away, beyond worried, and he texted me back saying he had just taken a ton of pills and booze, and that he was sorry. I called 911 on my home phone, and my friend on my cell, and stayed on the lines until the ambulance picked him up. I learned the next day that he almost didn't make it had I not called 911 right away. he probably wouldn't have pulled through. After that, I always keep my ringer on, and I always trust my gut. Story 20. On the 15th of January 2008, my dad had dropped my mom off at work like normal. He looked into his rearview mirror and saw my mom standing on the side of the road, unnaturally staring into space for several seconds, as if she didn't know what she was doing. She then crossed the road and went into work. My dad said that he had a terrible gut feeling after witnessing this. 15 minutes later, my mom was found in the stairwell by a colleague after suffering a major heart attack. She wasn't breathing and had no pulse, and unbelievably, no one knew or was willing to perform CPR until the paramedics arrived 10 minutes later. I was completely oblivious to these events until I got home from school. Thankfully, my mom is still with us, with relatively few side effects. A rather large miracle, in my opinion. Story 21. I know this will probably get lost, but here goes. Have had a couple of feelings. I'm a twin, and every now and then I can sense things or dream that something has happened. First that I remember was I was at the dinner table one night, and my brother, twin, had headed off to the gym. A couple of minutes after he left, I got a massive stomach cramp to the point where I had to curl up in a ball. Lasted about 2 minutes, and then it just went. A minute later, my brother came running through the front door saying he had rolled his car around the corner. He was trapped for about 2 minutes upside down with the seatbelt cutting into his lap. Freaked me and my parents out. The second one was only a couple of weeks ago. Brother and his fiancee had flown from Brisbane, Australia to Honolulu and were due to land while I was asleep. I dreamt that I was at the arrivals gate and he walked up and said he had a good flight, except for a little turbulence and that they were fine. When I woke up in the morning, my fiancee asked, I wonder if they have landed safely? I naturally just answered yes because he had told me. She freaked out more than I did. Sure enough, a message came through that afternoon saying that they had arrived safe. Had some turbulence, but all good. Other than that, if I am sad or down for no reason, I normally know that he is stressed. If I feel anxious or have butterflies in my stomach, he is excited about something. Story 22. Probably too late to this party, but I wanted to share my story. When I was 11, I saved up my allowance and wanted to buy a toy. My dad took my sister and I to the local toy store, and I bought an awesome lightsaber. Got in the back seat of the car, and we drove home. I should mention this was during a mild nor'easter storm in 1996, and the wind and rain were just starting to pick up. We pulled into the driveway, and my dad and sister got out of the car and went into the house. I was so excited about my new toy, I had to open it in the car. So I did, and while I was admiring the glory of my new Jedi weapon, I felt the Force speak to me. I all of a sudden felt the overwhelming urge to get out of the car and go into the house, like, I have to go inside now. So I did. Walked in the door, took off my shoes, and turned around to see one of the huge maple trees in my front yard fall over in a wind gust onto the back seat of the car where I was sitting, not 30 seconds after I had the urge to go inside. Went out to look, and there was a branch piercing the seat where I was sitting.